The sun was a hammer over Coyote Wash. It beat the dust into a fine red powder that coated every living thing, a second skin of thirst and heat. Cole squinted. The lines around his eyes etched deep, not just by the glare, but by 3 months of trail dust and sleepless nights. The longhorn cattle were sold. The price was good, and the weight of gold in his saddlebags was a heavy, satisfying thing. It meant security. It meant this hard land could not swallow him whole just yet. His horse, a weary roan named Buck, plodded the last few feet toward the livery, its head hanging low. The town shimmered, a collection of tired wood and wishful thinking held together by sheer stubbornness. Home. The word felt foreign and welcome all at once. For him, it meant a hot meal he did not have to cook over a fire, a bed that did not move beneath him, and the familiar face of his best friend. Eli. Miles away. In a small room behind May's Mercantile. Abigail was a world apart from the grit and sweat of the trail. She stood in a pool of afternoon light wearing a dress the color of fresh cream. It was simple cotton, with no lace or frills, but it was the finest thing she had ever owned. She turned slowly, the fabric whispering against the floorboards. In her hand, she held a plain gold band. It was not Eli's ring, but its twin, the one she would place on his finger. She slipped it onto her own thumb for a moment, feeling the solid, perfect circle of it. A promise. Eli was due back any day from his run guarding the gold shipment to Fort Union. He was a good man with a steady hand and a laugh that could make the driest season feel hopeful. Soon, this ring would be on his finger, and her life would truly begin on the quarter section of land by the Willow River, the only piece of ground for 50 miles that held water year-round. May, a woman whose face was a roadmap of every joy and sorrow in town, clucked her approval. It is a perfect fit, child, for a perfect future. Abigail smiled. A genuine, unguarded thing that made the little room feel brighter than the sun outside. The news arrived the way all bad news did in the territories, on a half-dead horse carrying a man whose face was a mask of dust and dread. The rider did not even have the strength to dismount, just slumped over his saddle horn and gasped out the story. Ambush. A canyon pass 10 miles south of the Cimarron. The guards were overwhelmed. The gold was gone. When someone finally asked the question everyone was afraid to voice, the man just shook his head. No survivors found. They searched for 2 days. He looked at the silent faces staring up at him. Eli Vance was with them. He is gone. The words fell into the dusty street like stones down a dry well. The sound of Abigail's future shattering was a silence so profound it was louder than a scream. She stood on the porch of the Mercantile, the gold ring suddenly cold and heavy in her hand. The world did not stop. The sun still burned. The dust still blew, but the light inside her had gone out. 72 hours. That was the time Judge Grigg gave her. The courthouse was the hottest place in Coyote Wash, a box of baked air that smelled of old paper, stale tobacco, and cheap whiskey. A single fan turned lazily in the corner, doing little more than stir the heat around. Judge Grigg was a man who looked like he'd been dried and cured by the sun, his skin tight over his bones and his eyes small and dark like a bird's. Beside him sat Ansel Vale, a land speculator with a smile as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. Vale owned half the town and was thirsty for the other half, especially any part that touched water. The judge cleared his throat, the sound a dry rasp. Abigail stood before him, dressed in a plain gray work dress, her face pale but her back ramrod straight. Cole was there. Having come the moment he heard, he stood against the back wall, his hat in his hands, a cold knot of grief and disbelief in his stomach. He had lost his friend, and now he had to watch this. Grigg read from a leather-bound book. His voice droned on about territorial statutes and public necessities, in cases of sudden demise and unprotected property vital to the community's welfare, specifically pertaining to water rights. The court is empowered by the Protectorate statute to ensure said property does not fall into disuse or foreign hands. He looked at Abigail over the top of his spectacles. Your claim filed jointly with the deceased Eli Vance, encompasses the only reliable access to the Willow River in this county. With the drought worsening, that access is a matter of public survival. A bitter, humorless laugh almost escaped Abigail's lips. Her land was not for the public. It was for her. It was the legacy her father had bled for. The future she and Eli were supposed to build. Vale whispered something to the judge, who nodded. Therefore, the court decrees that to secure the title and ensure proper stewardship, you, Miss Abigail, must enter into a state of matrimony with a court-approved suitor within 72 hours. The words hung in the suffocating air. A collective gasp rippled through the dozen or so onlookers. This was not law. This was theft dressed up in a starched collar. If you fail to comply, the court will have no choice but to seize the property under the common good provision and auction it to a party capable of managing its resources. Grigg's gaze flickered for a second toward Ansel Vale. Abigail found her voice, low and trembling with rage. "You have no right. That is my land, my home." The judge's expression did not change. "The law is the law. Young woman, it is designed to protect you, to protect the community. Now, as to the matter of a suitable candidate, the court requires a man of sound financial standing, good character, and the means to develop the land's resources for the benefit of all." He paused, letting his gaze sweep the room before it landed squarely on the man leaning against the back wall. "The court recognizes Cole Thatcher. He has just returned from a successful cattle drive. He is a man of means and a close friend of the deceased. He possesses the character and the capital to act as protector." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Cole. He felt as if he had been punched in the gut. The judge was not just stealing Eli's land. He was trying to use Cole, Eli's best friend, as the key to do it. The world tilted, the faces in the room blurring into a smear of shock and pity. He saw Abigail's eyes, wide with horror and a fresh, deeper betrayal. He saw the smug satisfaction on Vale's face. And he saw the ghost of Eli standing between them all, a silent, accusing phantom. A man named Crow, a rancher with a mean streak and a long-standing rivalry with both Cole and Eli, let out a low whistle. "Well, Thatcher, some men have all the luck." Crow's cronies snickered. The sound was ugly, and it snapped Cole out of his stupor. He pushed himself off the wall, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. "This is not right. Judge, he's barely gone a day." Grigg tapped his fingers on the book. "It is a tragedy. But the law and the drought? Wait for no man's grief. The proposal is on the table. The clock is running." Abigail looked from the judge to Cole, her pride and her terror at war in her eyes. She would not be sold like a broodmare. She opened her mouth to refuse, to tell them all to let the land burn before she would submit to such a humiliation. Later, as the brutal sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in angry strokes of orange and purple, a young boy from the livery found Cole. His name was Thomas, and he worshipped Eli. He pressed a sealed envelope into Cole's hand. "Eli gave this to me, sir, before he left. Said if he was not back in 2 months, I was to give it to you and only you." Cole's hands felt clumsy as he took it. He recognized Eli's handwriting, bold and clear, spelling his name across the folded paper. He walked to the water trough, the only place that felt cool, and broke the wax seal. The letter was short, written on a single sheet of paper, but every word carried the weight of a last will and testament. "Cole," it read, "if you are reading this, then my luck ran out. Listen to me. Vale and the judge have been sniffing around my claim for months. They know the river is the only thing that will matter when this drought really bites down. They will use any trick they can to get it. I know what they will do to Abigail. They will try to run her off or use some crooked law to take it. Do not let them. You are the only one I trust. If I do not come back, you have to marry her. Marry Abigail to save the land. It is not about you or her, not right now. It is about the water. Do not let those vultures steal our future. Protect her. Protect the land. Eli, Cole read the letter 3 times, the paper trembling in his hand. The words were a gut punch, but they were also a release. It was not the judge's scheme. It was not Vale's greed. It was Eli's final wish. A desperate, pragmatic plan from beyond the grave. The bitter irony was a taste like ash in his mouth. Eli, in his foresight, had laid out the very trap Cole had just walked into. But it was not a trap. It was a charge, a sacred duty. The conflict that had been tearing him apart, loyalty to his dead friend versus the obscenity of the court's demand, was suddenly resolved into one terrible, clear path. He found Abigail by the riverbank as dusk settled, the water a ribbon of silver in the failing light. She was throwing small, flat stones into the current, each one skipping once or twice before sinking into the darkness. She did not look at him as he approached. "I will not do it," she said, her voice flat. "I will not be a pawn in their game. I will burn the fields and poison the well before I let them have it that way." Cole stood beside her, the letter a warm weight in his shirt pocket. He looked at the stubborn set of her jaw, the grief that made her beautiful face seem carved from stone. He saw the spirit that Eli had loved. He knew what he had to say would wound her pride, would feel like another betrayal. But it was the only way. "I know," he said, his voice quiet. "This is not their game. It is ours now." He looked her in the eyes then, letting her see the raw grief and the resolve he felt. "We will accept the judge's terms. We will marry." There was a sharp intake of breath from her, a flash of fire in her eyes, and he held up a hand to stop the torrent of words he knew was coming. "But we will do it on our terms. It will be a marriage in name only, a partnership in law. The land will be safe, under our combined name, and they cannot touch it. You will live in your house. I will live in mine. You will have your freedom. Your life will be your own. I am not asking for a wife, Abigail. I am asking for an ally, and I am doing it because Eli asked me to." He did not show her the letter. It felt too personal, too raw, a final conversation between him and his friend. But she saw the truth of it in his face. She saw it was not about greed or opportunity. It was about loyalty, a terrible, heartbreaking loyalty that was now binding them together. She stared at the dark water, the last of the light gone from the sky. The choice was not a choice at all. It was survival. It was about choosing the lesser of 2 profound wrongs to protect the only right thing she had left in the world, her home. "Very well," she said, the words barely a whisper against the sound of the river. "We will do it your way. A partnership. In law only." The wedding was a hurried, sterile affair, an echo of the court proceeding that had forced it into being. It took place in the same suffocating room, under the same lazy fan that pushed the hot dust around. Judge Grigg recited the vows as if reading a bill of lading, his voice devoid of any warmth. The few townspeople who bothered to attend watched with hungry eyes, their whispers a dry rustle in the corners. Ruby, who ran the small hotel, missed nothing, her sharp gaze cataloging every detail of the bride's plain dress, the same one she had worn to court, the groom's stiff posture, the space between them, a chasm wide enough to drive a wagon through. When Cole placed the simple gold band on Abigail's finger, it felt less like a sacrament and more like the closing of a deal. It was not Eli's ring. That one was tucked away in a small wooden box, a sacred relic of a life that would never be. This new ring was a brand, a legal mark of ownership that belonged not to him, but to the circumstances that bound them. They spoke their vows, the words "I do" falling like stones into the silence. There was no kiss. They turned and walked out of the courthouse, husband and wife in the eyes of the law, and strangers in every other way. That night, Cole brought his bedroll and saddlebags into the main room of Abigail's small ranch house. The house was meticulously clean, smelling of pine soap and dried herbs. It was Eli's house, their house, and Cole felt like an intruder in every corner. He unrolled his blankets by the cold hearth, a respectable distance from the closed door of the bedroom. Abigail came out. a shawl around her shoulders against a chill that was more memory than reality. "The terms are simple," she said, her voice even. "This room is yours. The rest of the house is mine. The ranch work. We will discuss each morning. You will have your duties. I will have mine. We are partners. Mr. Thatcher, nothing more." Cole looked up at her from his place on the floor. He nodded. That was the agreement. Mrs. Thatcher. Her name, his name, sounded foreign and wrong on their own tongues. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken grief and the sheer awkwardness of their situation. He would not touch her. He would not cross the line she had drawn down the center of their lives. Respect was the hard-packed ground they would walk on, and it was the only thing that made this arrangement bearable. The days settled into a tense rhythm. Abigail rose before the sun, emerging from her room fully dressed and ready for work. She was no fragile flower. She managed the accounts, oversaw the 2 ranch hands, and planned the winter feed with a sharp mind that missed nothing. The men, at first wary of taking orders from a woman, soon learned her instructions were clear, fair, and smart. The older hand, a leathery man named Rivera, who had been loyal to Abigail's father, watched it all with quiet approval. He saw the way she checked the fences and the intelligence in her eyes as she calculated the dwindling water supply. He also saw Cole. Cole did not interfere with her running of the place. Instead, he simply worked. He spent a week reinforcing the old well, replacing rotten timbers and deepening it by 10 feet until the water that came up was cleaner and colder. Then he started on a project of his own, down by the riverbed. Day after day, he hauled rock and packed earth, building a low, sturdy dam to create a reservoir, a buffer against the relentless drought. He worked with his back in his hands, a quiet, steady presence on the edge of her world. They spoke of ranch business, of weather, and cattle prices. Their conversations were polite, efficient, and utterly devoid of personal feeling. The outside world did not leave them to their silent truce. Ansel Vale sent a polite notice from the bank, a reminder of a small loan her father had taken out, a debt Vale had quietly acquired. It was not due for months, but the message was clear: I am watching. Then, Rivera found a section of fence cut clean through on the north pasture, the wire snipped with pliers. Nothing was taken, it was just a warning. On Sunday, Reverend Pike made a special trip out to the ranch. He sat in their main room, accepting a glass of water, and spoke at length about the sacred duties of a wife, about submission and obedience, his eyes resting on Abigail with a look of pious disapproval. Cole, who was mending a bridle on the porch, listened to the entire sermon without saying a word. When the Reverend finally left, Cole looked at Abigail. He has soft hands for a man who speaks so much of hard work. A flicker of something, maybe amusement, crossed her face before she extinguished it. "He is a man who speaks for other men's interests," she replied, and went back to her ledgers. The first real test came on a moonless night 2 weeks later. The dogs started barking, a frantic, ragged sound that cut through the deep silence of the plains. Cole was awake in an instant, pulling on his boots and grabbing the rifle he kept beside his bedroll. From the other room, he heard the soft click of a rifle bolt. Abigail was awake too. He met Rivera by the corral, the older man holding a lantern and a shotgun. "Trouble," Rivera said, his voice a low growl. "The yearlings. They are in the west pasture." They could hear the faint, distressed bleating of the calves and the low shouts of men on horseback. It was Crow's men. Cole would know their loud, sloppy work anywhere. Cole and Rivera saddled their horses in a practiced, urgent silence. The creak of leather and the jingle of a bridle were the only sounds. As they prepared to ride out, the front door of the house opened. Abigail stood silhouetted in the doorway, her father's heavy Winchester rifle in her hands. She did not say a word, just walked to the edge of the porch and knelt, bracing the rifle on the railing. She was aiming not at the house or the barn, but out into the darkness, toward the sounds of the commotion. Cole paused, one foot in the stirrup. "What are you doing? Stay inside where it is safe." She did not look at him. "This is my home," she said, her voice as cold and steady as the long steel barrel of the rifle. "My cattle. I will not hide from thieves." He and Rivera rode hard into the darkness, guided by the sounds. They burst over a small rise to see 3 riders attempting to drive a dozen calves away from their mothers. The rustlers were clumsy, more vandals than professionals. Cole fired a shot over their heads, and Rivera discharged his shotgun into the air, the boom echoing across the prairie. The men cursed, startled, and turned to fight. One of them leveled a pistol at Cole. Before he could fire, a sharp crack echoed from the direction of the ranch house, a sound completely different from their own shots. A puff of dust exploded on the ground just in front of the lead rider's horse. The animal reared in panic. Throwing its rider, the shot was not lucky. It was perfect. A warning delivered with lethal precision from 200 yards away in the dark. The rustlers were stunned. They looked from the 2 armed men before them to the distant, unseen shooter at the house. This was not the easy raid on a helpless widow they had planned. They scrambled, collected their fallen man, and fled into the night, leaving the calves behind. Back at the house, the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and adrenaline. Abigail still held the rifle, though she had lowered it. Her face was pale in the lantern light, but her hands were steady. Cole dismounted, his heart still pounding. That was a fine shot. He said it was the first compliment he had ever given her. "Thank you," she replied, her voice tight. "I did not want them to harm my livestock." "My livestock? Not ours." The wall between them was still there, solid and high, but as he looked at her, standing guard on her own land, he felt a surge of respect so powerful it almost stole his breath. She was not just Eli's intended. She was a force in her own right, as strong and unyielding as the hard ground they stood on. She met his gaze for a long moment, and, for the first time, he saw something other than grief or anger in her eyes. It was a flicker of confusion, a silent acknowledgement of the strange alliance that was growing between them. Then she turned and went back inside, the heavy door closing with a soft thud. A week passed. The fence was mended. The calves were safe. An uneasy peace settled over the ranch. One afternoon, Abigail went to the small post box at the end of the long dirt road that led to her property. Inside, among a catalog for farm equipment and a letter from her cousin back east, was a plain, unmarked envelope. Her name was written on it in a crude, unfamiliar block script. There was no stamp, meaning it had been delivered by hand. She opened it, a feeling of unease prickling her skin. The note inside was short, the words pieced together from letters cut from a newspaper. A ragged, anonymous message. "Eli is alive. Do not trust Thatcher." Abigail's blood ran cold. She read the words again and again, her hand trembling. It was a cruel joke. It had to be. Eli was gone. The world had told her he was gone. Cole, with his quiet grief and his solemn promise, believed he was gone. But the words on the page stared back at her, a seed of impossible, poisonous hope. Eli is alive. The second sentence was a blade that slid between her ribs. Do not trust Thatcher. She looked back at the ranch house, at the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney where the man she had married was likely sitting. The man who had protected her land, who had honored his word, who was, according to this venomous little note, her enemy, the world, which had just begun to settle into a new, hard shape, suddenly fractured into 1,000 sharp, uncertain pieces. The anonymous letter was a splinter under Abigail's skin, a constant, irritating presence. Every quiet act of decency from Cole now seemed suspect, a performance for an unseen audience. When he rose early to make coffee, setting a cup on the edge of the porch for her without a word, she wondered if it was kindness or calculation. When he spent an afternoon patiently reshoeing her mare, a job Eli had always done, the memory brought a fresh wave of grief mixed with a new, sour mistrust. He felt the change in her. The small space they had carved out, built on mutual respect, had grown cold and wide again. He saw her watching him when she thought he was not looking. Her eyes narrowed with a question he did not know how to answer because he did not know what it was. He assumed it was her grief, a wall he had no right to breach. So he kept his distance and let the silence between them fester. The drought, however, did not respect walls or silence. It was a slow thief, stealing the green from the grass, the water from the creek, and the hope from the faces of the ranchers. The Willow River itself had shrunk to a muddy brown ribbon, and the cattle stood listlessly, their ribs showing like washboards. It was then that Ansel Vale chose to ride out to the ranch, his horse sleek and well-fed. An insult in itself. He found Abigail near the barn, her face smudged with dust. He removed his hat, his smile as smooth and dry as a polished stone. A difficult season. "Mrs. Thatcher, my sympathies." He spoke of community, of shared hardship, and of his deep concern for the town's welfare. Then he made his offer. "I have the capital to install pumps, to manage the water properly for the good of all. If you would be willing to sell a portion of your river rights, just the access, I would ensure the entire valley survives. Think of it as a civic duty." She looked at his polished boots, then at the cracked earth around them. The word she used was a simple one. "No." Vale's smile tightened at the edges. "A pity. The town council is meeting next week to discuss emergency measures. Without a private citizen willing to cooperate, they may be forced to declare the river a public utility, a managed utility." He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving the threat hanging in the air like dust. It was the same tactic as before, using the law as a cudgel to get what he wanted. That evening, Cole spread a piece of canvas on the main room floor. He had sketched a map of their valley in charcoal, marking the river, their ranch, and the 3 smaller homesteads downstream. "This is what Vale wants," he said, pointing to their land. "He who controls this bend controls everything, but if we work with the others, we can break his hold." He traced a new line with the charcoal, a long, curving path from the river. "We dig an irrigation ditch, a proper one. We can divert enough water to fill our reservoir and still send a fair share down to the Miller, Hobbs, and Patterson places. If we all have water, Vale has no crisis to manage." It was a bold plan, a direct challenge to Vale's authority. It required immense work and, more importantly, it required trust. Abigail looked from the map to Cole's face. The letter screamed in her memory. Do not trust Thatcher. But her own eyes saw the logic in his plan, the fairness of it. This was an act of creation, not of theft. Her pragmatism, the hard, practical sense that had kept her going, won out over the poison of the anonymous words. "We will need more hands," she said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. "I will ride out to the others in the morning." Her agreement was a fragile bridge built across a chasm of doubt. For 2 weeks, the valley was alive with the sound of shovels and picks striking dry earth. The Miller boys, the aging Patterson, and even Hobbs, a man known for his sour disposition, worked alongside Cole and Rivera. Abigail organized the effort, managing the food and water for the work crews, her leadership emerging as naturally as a spring from the ground. She moved with a purpose that left no room for her own fears. They were a small community forged in sweat and a shared desire to survive. They were winning. The ditch was nearly complete, the banks reinforced with stone and timber, a testament to what people could do when they stood together against a common foe. The sky turned yellow first. A strange, sickly light fell over the land, and the air grew heavy and still. Rivera squinted at the horizon. "Dust storm," he said, his voice grim, "and a bad one." The wind hit them moments later, a physical blow that stole their breath and scoured the world with sand. The sun vanished. The world became a roaring, brown chaos. They huddled behind a rock outcropping, the men trying to secure the tools and the horses. Through the gale, they heard a new sound, a deep, angry roar that was not the wind. It came from the mountains, a flash flood. The sudden storm, combined with a week of unseasonably warm weather melting the high snows, had sent a wall of water surging down the dry riverbed. The first wave hit the banks with the force of a locomotive, a churning mass of brown water, mud, and uprooted trees. It tore at their newly built ditch, ripping away stones and timbers. Abigail, who had been trying to pull a young calf away from the rising water, was caught on a crumbling section of the bank. The ground gave way beneath her feet, and she was plunged into the violent, icy current. The water was a monster, pulling her under, its force overwhelming. For a moment, she saw Cole's face, his mouth open in a shout that was lost to the storm. He did not hesitate. He ran down the collapsing bank and threw himself into the flood. The current seized him, slamming him against submerged rocks. He felt a searing pain in his side, but ignored it. His eyes fixed on Abigail. He reached her, grabbing a handful of her dress, and fought the river's pull. He was strong, but the water was stronger. It tumbled them over and over, until he finally managed to grab the branch of a fallen cottonwood tree near the opposite bank. He clung to it, gasping for air, holding Abigail tight against him as the debris-filled water raged past. He hauled them out of the river and onto the muddy bank, where they collapsed, shivering and exhausted. The dust storm gave way to a driving, cold rain. They were miles from the ranch house, and Abigail was shaking uncontrollably. Cole, his side bleeding freely from a long, jagged gash, knew they would not survive the night in the open. He half-carried, half-dragged her to a small, dilapidated structure he knew of, an old grain shed on a rise above the creek. Inside, it was dark and smelled of mice and damp earth, but it was dry. He found some old grain sacks and used them to block the worst of the wind coming through the cracks in the walls. With his flint and steel, and a few dry splinters of wood from a broken crate, he managed to start a small, sputtering fire. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the walls. The roar of the flood and the drumming of the rain on the tin roof was a constant, enclosing sound. In the small bubble of warmth and light, the world shrank to just the two of them. Abigail looked at the dark stain spreading across his shirt. "You are hurt," she said, her voice trembling. "It is nothing." But it was not nothing. When he peeled the wet fabric away, the cut was deep, oozing blood. She tore a long strip from her petticoat, her hands surprisingly steady now. She cleaned the wound with water from his canteen and bound it tightly, her touch gentle and sure. He watched her face in the firelight, the focused line of her brow, the compassion that had overridden everything else. For the first time, he saw the woman Eli had loved, not just the grieving fiancé or the wary partner. In town, the storm raged with equal fury. Ruby was doing her weekly cleaning of the hotel rooms. A traveling land surveyor had left in a hurry that morning to escape the coming weather, and he had left his room a mess. As Ruby stripped the bed, a small, leather-bound ledger fell from between the mattresses. It was not hers, and it was not the hotel's. Curiosity was a stronger force in Ruby than propriety. She opened it. The book was filled with neat columns of names and figures. She saw Ansel Vale's name repeated over and over. Beside it were dates, and beside the dates were sums of money. And then she saw the other name. The recipient of these payments entered with the same meticulous care, Judge Grigg. It was a record of bribes, a meticulous accounting of the price of justice in Coyote Wash. Ruby closed the book, her heart hammering. She finally understood the whole rotten business. Back in the shed, the fire crackled, a warm and living thing in the cold dark. The rain softened to a steady drumming on the roof. Cole, weakened from the blood loss and the cold, had drifted into an exhausted sleep. Abigail sat watching him, pulling a rough wool blanket tighter around her own shoulders. His face, so often a mask of guarded calm, was relaxed in sleep. Looking younger and more vulnerable, he had saved her life. It was a simple, undeniable fact, an action that spoke louder than any anonymous, pasted-together words. The fear she had felt when she saw him throw himself into the water had been sharp and pure. It was not fear for a partner or an ally. It was fear for him. The realization shook her to her core. She was afraid of losing Cole Thatcher. And that feeling, so new and so powerful, felt like a profound betrayal of the man she had sworn to love forever. She looked at the man sleeping by the fire, the man who was her husband in name only, and felt the solid ground of her world shift into something unknown, something terrifying, and something that felt, in that quiet, sheltered moment, undeniably true. The first thing Cole was aware of was the silence. The storm had passed. A pale, watery light filtered through the cracks in the grain shed, tracing lines across the dusty floor. The only sound was the slow drip of water from the eaves and the soft crackle of the dying fire. Abigail was awake, sitting on the other side of the embers, her knees drawn to her chest and a rough blanket pulled around her shoulders. She was watching him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. The charged silence of the night before had settled into something calmer, more contemplative. It was the kind of quiet that demanded truth. He tried to sit up, and a sharp, pulling pain in his side made him gasp. She was there in an instant, pushing gently on his shoulder. "Do not be a fool," she said, her voice low. "You will tear the wound open again." He eased back down, his head resting against an old grain sack. He looked at her, at the genuine concern in her eyes, and knew he could not let the space between them be filled with any more secrets. "I have to tell you something," he began, his voice raspy. "About Eli, about why I agreed to the judge's order." He took a breath, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "Before he left on that trip, Eli gave me a letter. He told me if he did not come back, I was to read it." He told her everything then, the contents of the letter, Eli's fears about Vale and the judge, the terrible weight of his friend's last request. He spoke of his own guilt, the feeling that he was a usurper in his friend's life, a ghost living in his house, married to his intended. It is his brand on this land. Abigail, his dreams. I swore I would not let them be stolen, but I feel like a thief myself every morning I wake up under your roof. As he spoke, he shifted, and his torn shirt exposed more of his side. Below the fresh, dark line of the gash from the flood, an old scar gleamed white against his skin, a puckered, ugly thing from a time long before he had ever heard of Coyote Wash, a memory from the war, he said simply, answering her unspoken question. A reminder that sometimes you do things not because you want to, but because you must, to protect the person next to you. I swore an oath to Eli, and I will honor it. He met her eyes, his own gaze clear and unwavering. And I swear this to you. I will not take anything from you that you do not freely choose to give. I am your husband-in-law, but in all other things, I am the man Eli trusted to stand guard. Nothing more. For a long time, she said nothing. She looked at the fire, at the small, sturdy walls that had sheltered them, at the man who had confessed his deepest conflict. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she slipped the plain gold wedding band from her finger. She did not throw it or discard it. She placed it gently on the flat top of a wooden crate that sat between them. The ring sat in the dim light, a perfect circle of duty and law. She finally looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I have been so alone. Cole, after my father died, there was only Eli. When he was gone, it felt like the whole world was empty. I thought I could fill it with work, with holding on to this land, but the loneliness is a cold thing. It finds all the cracks." She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the crumpled, anonymous note. "And then this came. I wanted to hate you. It would have been easier to hate you." He took the note, his brow furrowed as he looked at the crude, pasted letters. His face was a mixture of shock and a sudden, weary understanding. "It is a lie, Abigail," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Another one of Vale's tricks to break us apart." He looked up from the note, and she saw the undisguised truth in his face. His actions had already proven the note a lie. The rescue, the quiet work, the confession. They were truths she could touch and see. She believed him, completely. "Duty brought you into my house," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A promise to a dead man. I respected you for it, even when I did not want to. But what you did yesterday, in the river, and what you have said tonight, you did not do that for Eli. You did that for me." She looked at him, at the exhaustion and pain and honor all resting in his steady gaze. "Tonight has turned duty into something else." He moved slowly, ignoring the protest of his wounded side, and closed the small distance between them. He gently touched her face, his calloused thumb brushing away a single tear that traced a path through the dust on her cheek. The air grew thick with a meaning that had nothing to do with contracts or land, and everything to do with two lonely people finding a flicker of warmth in a cold world. Their first kiss was not a spark of passion, but the slow, deep relief of a truth finally acknowledged. It was a conscious choice, a quiet agreement that the guard could finally be lowered. In the shelter of the storm's aftermath, shielded from the prying eyes of the world, they found a comfort in each other that went beyond words. The fire burned down to glowing embers as the night finally gave way, and the small, rough shed became a sanctuary where a marriage of convenience was irrevocably transformed. The morning sun was bright, cruelly so, making the flood-ravaged landscape look even more desolate. They walked back to the ranch in a quiet accord, the world feeling both the same and entirely different. The awkwardness of strangers had been replaced by a soft, unspoken intimacy. From the outside, nothing had changed. They agreed it was safer that way, to present the same united, businesslike front to the world, to Vale and his schemes. But as they walked, his hand brushed hers, a fleeting touch that was a promise in itself. They did not know that a rider from Crow's ranch, out checking for stray cattle, had seen them from a distant ridge, two figures emerging from the old grain shed at dawn, their path leading back to the same house. The seed of a new, more scandalous rumor was already on its way to town. Rivera met them at the barn, his weathered face breaking with relief. He asked no questions, simply nodding as they explained the flood and the need for shelter. They spent the next hour assessing the damage, which was blessedly light. The new ditch was mauled, but not destroyed. The house was untouched. A fragile sense of normalcy began to return. Cole went to the well to draw fresh water to clean his wound properly, and Abigail stood on the porch, looking out at her land, her home. For the first time since Eli's death, the future did not feel like an ending, but a difficult, uncertain, and yet hopeful beginning. That was when they heard the sound of a horse approaching at a canter, its pace urgent. A rider came into view, not a cowboy, but a woman wearing a deputy's star on her vest. She reined in her horse, her expression grim. Abigail recognized her as Nora, the sheriff's new deputy, a stoic and capable woman who wasted no words. "Mrs. Thatcher," Nora said, dismounting quickly. "Sheriff sent me. You and Mr. Thatcher need to come to town. Right away." Abigail's newfound peace evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. "What is it? Has something happened?" She looked past the deputy, her mind racing through all the possibilities. Was it Vale? Had Judge Grigg issued a new order? Nora's eyes were filled with a strange mixture of pity and professional duty. She looked from Abigail to Cole as he came to stand beside his wife. "There is news," she said, her voice flat, delivering the words like blows. "It is about Eli Vance. He was found this morning by a patrol near the old mission ruins. He is weak, but he is alive. Abigail, he is asking for you." The ride into town was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every landmark held a memory that was now contested. Every silence was filled with unspoken questions. The intimacy forged in the grain shed felt a lifetime away. A fragile dream, shattered by the harsh light of a resurrected past. Abigail rode with her back straight, her face a pale mask of composure. But inside, she was a whirlwind of confusion and a grief so profound it felt like a betrayal to every new feeling she possessed. Beside her, Cole was a study in stillness, his features carved from stone. He was the protector, the husband, the ally, and now he was the obstacle. The reality of Eli's return had placed an impassable mountain between them. and the path they had just begun to walk together had vanished. Eli was in a room at Ruby's hotel, propped up on pillows, looking thin and breakable. The sun-browned, confident man Abigail remembered was gone, replaced by a stranger with haunted eyes and a new tension around his mouth. When she walked in, his face lit with a flicker of the old light, a painful, beautiful thing to see. "Abby," he whispered, his voice hoarse. She went to him, her movement stiff and uncertain. Cole remained by the door, his hat in his hands, a silent guard at the border of a life that was no longer his to claim. Eli's gaze found Cole, then traveled down to the plain gold band on Abigail's finger. A slow, weary understanding dawned on his face. He looked back at Abigail. He did good. Then he kept his promise. There was no jealousy in his voice, only a deep, abiding sorrow. Later that day, in the quiet of the town's small, empty church, Eli told them the whole story. The three of them sat on a rough-hewn pew, a strange trinity bound by loyalty and impossible circumstances. The ambush was a lie, Eli explained. It was a trap, set by Vale. He wanted me dead so he could force you into a corner. Abby, I realized it too late. I managed to get away during the chaos, but Crow's men have been hunting me ever since. They caught me a month ago, kept me locked in a line shack in the high country. He paused, the memory shadowing his eyes. They were going to kill me. Then they heard about the marriage. Vale saw a new opportunity. He looked from Cole to Abigail, his expression grim. They let me go on one condition. I am to testify at a hearing that Cole forced you into this marriage against your will, that he took advantage of your grief to steal my land. If I do it, Judge Grigg will annul the marriage and Vale will let me walk away. If I do not, Crow has promised to finish the job he started in the canyon. He looked at his hands. I sent that letter. Cole, I asked you to protect her. And you did. I just never figured I would be the one they would use to tear it all down. He finally looked up, his gaze filled with a terrible clarity. But seeing you two, I know this is not just about the land anymore. Is it? Vale did not wait for the official hearing. He began his trial in the court of public opinion that very afternoon. He stood on the saloon porch, Crow and his men flanking him, and spoke in a loud, concerned voice about the sanctity of marriage and the protection of vulnerable women. He painted Cole as a cunning opportunist who had used his friend's tragic death to seize the most valuable property in the county. The story was simple, ugly, and effective. The whispers that had started when Cole and Abigail were seen returning from the grain shed now had a narrative to latch onto. People looked at Cole with suspicion, at Abigail with pity. Judge Grigg, looking solemn and impartial, announced from the courthouse steps that an inquiry would be held in 2 days to examine the validity of the Thatcher marriage, for the good of all parties involved. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Cole and Abigail walked to the low hill that overlooked the Willow River. For months, they had lived and worked together, but they had never been more separate. The wind stirred the leaves of the willows, a sound like a whispered secret. Cole stopped and turned to her, his face etched with a pain he could no longer hide. This is your choice, Abigail. Not mine, not Vale's, and not Eli's. It has to be yours. He is the man you were supposed to build a life with. He is back, if you want that life. I will not stand in the way. I will tell the judge I coerced you. I will sign whatever papers he puts in front of me. I will leave. The words cost him everything. A sacrifice laid bare in the fading light. He would give her up to keep her safe and free. The final, most painful act in his promise to his friend. She looked at him, her heart tearing in two. The life she had wanted, the man she had loved, was being offered back to her. But she was not the same woman who had waited for him in a cream-colored dress. The world was not the same. The love she felt for the memory of Eli was a pure, true thing. But the feelings she had for the man standing before her now were tangled with respect, gratitude, and a desire that had been born in a shared night of terror and truth. How could she choose? How could she not? While they stood on that hill of impossible choices, Ruby and Deputy Nora met in the back office of the hotel. The ledger detailing Judge Griggs' bribes was open on the table between them. "This is enough to remove him from the bench," Nora said. Her voice clipped. "But it does not prove the larger conspiracy. We need to connect Vale to something more than just local land fraud." Ruby, who had spent the day listening to the gossip of traveling salesmen, slid another document across the table. It was a freight invoice she had found, discarded in the trash. It detailed payment to a geological surveyor, a man hired by the Trans-Western Railroad Company, for a report on water access points through the Coyote Wash Valley. The payment had been authorized by Ansel Vale. Nora looked at the paper, then back at Ruby, her eyes wide with understanding. "He does not just want the water for the town," she said, a slow anger building in her voice. "He is going to sell the rights to the railroad. They will build a depot here, a watering station. The value of that land, of that water, would be a fortune. The forced marriage, the ambush, all of it. It was just a tool to get his hands on the one thing the railroad needed to come through this valley." Nora folded the paper carefully. "Now we have him." Abigail left Cole on the hill and walked back into town alone. She found herself standing outside the small, unfinished church. Pushing the door open, she stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of sawdust and raw pine. In the corner sat the wedding bench, the one Eli had been carving for their ceremony. One side was intricately detailed with carved willow leaves. The other was still rough, unfinished. She ran her hand over the smooth, sanded wood, then over the raw, splintery section. It was a perfect symbol of her life, a beautiful, detailed past, and a future that had been violently interrupted. She thought of Eli, the boy she had loved, and the haunted man he had become. She thought of Cole, the stranger who had become her husband, her partner, her protector. Loyalty to the past was a powerful thing. It could anchor you, give you roots, but it could also become a tombstone, pinning you to a place you no longer belonged. The wind whistled through a crack in the window frame, a lonely sound in the empty church, and in that quiet moment, surrounded by the ghosts of what might have been, Abigail finally knew what she had to do. Her choice was not about what was owed, but about what was true. Abigail did not walk from the church with her head bowed in contemplation. She walked with the brisk, determined stride of a commander whose battle plan had just become clear. Her first stop was not the ranch, but the small office of the deputy sheriff. She found Nora cleaning her pistol, a look of grim focus on her face. Abigail laid out the entire story, from the Protectorate statute to Eli's confession and the railroad invoice. She spoke without emotion, presenting the facts like stones she was laying for a foundation. Nora listened, her expression unchanging, but when Abigail was finished, she slid the pistol back into its holster with a sound of finality. "I have what I need," she said. "You go home and protect what is yours. I will handle the law in this town." Next, Abigail found Eli. He was by the river, throwing stones into the water, just as she had been doing on the day Cole had made his proposal. She stood beside him. "I have made my choice," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will not be a widow to a memory, Eli, and I will not let those men win. Your fight is now my fight. His fight." She did not need to say Cole's name. A sad, knowing smile touched Eli's lips. "He was always the better man," he said softly. Then he stood up, the weariness in his bones replaced by a flicker of his old resolve. "Well, he cannot have all the fun. Let us go home." When they reached the ranch, Cole was waiting on the porch, the setting sun at his back. He had seen them coming, two figures walking together out of a past he could not share. Abigail did not hesitate. She walked right up to him. "My home is here, Cole," she said, leaving no room for doubt. "And I will not be driven out of it, not by law, and not by force." He looked from her determined face to Eli, who gave a single, solid nod. The triangle of their lives had resolved itself into a straight, unbending line of defense. They were not two men and a woman caught between them. They were three people standing together for the same piece of ground. They did not have to wait long. As twilight bled the color from the sky, they saw them coming. Vale and Crow, leading a dozen riders, their forms dark silhouettes against the horizon. They were not a posse, they were a private army. The small ranchers, the Millers, Patterson, and Hobbs saw them too. They had been watching, waiting. They rode not to the town for help, but to the ranch, armed with old farm rifles and a shared stake in the shimmering thread of water that Cole's ditch had promised them. A community was not something you were born into. It was something you chose in the face of a threat. Tonight, they chose. Before the first shot was fired, another group approached, this one on foot and carrying not guns, but lanterns and self-righteousness. Reverend Pike led them, a small flock of his most pious followers. He held up a hand as if to ward off evil. "Abigail Thatcher," he called out, his voice booming with false concern. "We have come to deliver you from this den of iniquity. We will not let your grief be exploited by this man of violence in a sinful, unblessed union." Abigail stepped onto the porch, the lantern light catching the cold fire in her eyes. She let him finish, her silence more commanding than any shout. When he was done, she spoke, her voice carrying in the tense quiet. "Where was your concern, Reverend, when Judge Grigg used the law to try and sell me like livestock? Where was your moral outrage when Ansel Vale threatened to take my home? This man you call violent saved my life. This union you call sinful has protected my property. The law you preach about was twisted into a weapon against me, and the only sin I see here tonight is hypocrisy. You came to save me only when it served the man who pays for your church's new steeple. Now take your flock and go. God will be judged by the company he keeps tonight, and I do not think he is standing with you." The crowd faltered, their certainty punctured by the truth. They mumbled amongst themselves and, without the conviction of their leader, they melted back into the darkness. Then the shooting started. Vale's men tried to rush the barn, hoping to set it ablaze. The dry wind, hot and restless, would have carried the flames to the entire ranch in minutes. But Cole had anticipated it. He had placed his small force of ranchers in a crossfire position. Their first volley was disciplined and effective, driving the attackers back. Eli, positioned by the corral, fired with a calm precision. Every shot a small act of penance and redemption. In the chaos, a bullet tore through Rivera's shoulder. He went down, but as Hobbs dragged him to cover, the old man clutched the lantern he had been holding. He propped it on a hay bale, a single point of light in the darkness, a beacon of their defiance. "We do not yield," he gritted out through the pain. The main assault came at the ditch. If they could destroy the head gate, they could still win the war for the water. The fighting there was close and brutal. Cole moved through the shadows, directing his men. A calm center in the storm of gunpowder and shouts. A bullet seared across his arm. A hot, vicious line of pain. He stumbled but did not fall. In a lull, Abigail was there, tearing a strip from her dress, her hands quick and sure as she wrapped the wound. The smell of his blood and her nearness was a strange and powerful anchor in the madness. They were no longer just partners in law. They were partners in battle, their bond sealed by a shared danger. In town, Nora moved with the force of a storm herself, armed with her warrants and Ruby's evidence. She walked into Judge Grigg's study and placed him under arrest for conspiracy and bribery. The judge, so used to being the source of power, crumbled into a sputtering, indignant old man. At the same time, Ruby stood in the telegraph office, the rhythmic click and clack of the machine sending her message out into the wider world. A call for federal marshals, a plea for a law bigger and cleaner than the one for sale in Coyote Wash. Back at the ranch, a stray bullet from one of Crow's men struck a lantern near the dry fields. The glass shattered, and the oil ignited the parched grass. The hot wind seized the flames, and a wall of red and orange roared to life, racing across the prairie. The fire became a third army in the field, impartial and terrifying, threatening to consume them all. The fighting sputtered to a halt as both sides stared at the monster they had unleashed. The red glow illuminated the whole valley, and in its hellish light, the irrigation ditch shone like a last, desperate line of defense, a moat of salvation against a sea of fire. As the flames forced a retreat, it seemed the night was won. The defenders were exhausted, wounded, and low on ammunition, but they had held their ground. The sun was just a pale suggestion in the east. But the fight was not over. A lone rider approached, a dirty white cloth tied to his saddle horn. He stopped 100 yards from the house. "Vale has a message," the man yelled. "He has May, the seamstress. Took her from her shop an hour ago. He wants to negotiate. Cole Thatcher, alone, at the rock formation they call Serpent's Cut. At sunrise. You come alone, or the woman dies." The rider wheeled his horse and galloped away, leaving the ultimatum to hang in the smoke-filled air. The siege was over. The duel was about to begin. The sunrise at Serpent's Cut was a merciless affair. It did not creep over the horizon, but stabbed through the narrow rock formations, casting the canyon in a stark pattern of brilliant light and deep, cold shadow. Cole walked into the natural arena alone, his hands empty, his steps measured. He was the bait, a solitary figure moving toward the center of a spider web. High above, hidden in the crevices of the canyon wall, Abigail and Deputy Nora lay prone, rifles resting on the stone before them. They were the trap. Vale stood by a rock outcropping, a picture of smug triumph. Crow was beside him, a cruel smile on his face, his hand never far from his gun. Between two of their men stood May, her face pale with terror, a gag silencing any cry she might make. "You are a fool to have come." "Thatcher," Vale called out, his voice echoing in the enclosed space. A romantic fool. It was then that Eli appeared, scrambling down a side path. He ran toward Vale, his face a mask of desperation. "I am done with them," he shouted, his voice ringing with practiced betrayal. "She chose him. Let them have each other. Just give me what you promised. I will sign any paper. I will testify to anything you want." Crow laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I knew you did not have the stomach for a real fight." Vale, however, simply smiled, gesturing for Eli to come closer. He was drawing all the pieces on his board into the center, right where Nora and Abigail wanted them. Nora chose that moment to rise. "Ansel Vale," she called down, her voice clear and carrying like a bell. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and kidnapping." For a second, the canyon was utterly still. Then, all at once, it exploded into a chaos of noise and motion. Vale shoved May toward his men and drew a pistol. Crow went for his own gun. But Cole was already moving, diving behind a cluster of boulders as the first bullet sparked off the rock around him. From the ridge, Nora's rifle cracked, pinning Vale behind his cover. Abigail had a different target. She saw one of Crow's men, a man with a torch, creeping toward a small, dry storage shed at the edge of the clearing. He meant to start another fire, to create a diversion and cover their escape. Abigail took a steadying breath. Her hand was firm on the rifle's stock, the plain gold ring on her finger a cool, solid weight against the wood. It was a promise to the future, not the past. She fired. The man with the torch dropped it and crumpled to the ground. In the swirling dust and echoing gunfire, Eli made his move. He lunged not at Cole, but at the gunman closest to Vale, taking him down with the force of his charge. Another gunman turned on him, and Cole rose to fire. But a third shot came from a different direction, aimed squarely at Cole's back. Eli saw it. He threw himself sideways, shoving Cole to the ground. The bullet that would have struck Cole's heart tore through Eli's side instead. He collapsed with a cry of pain, his act of redemption paid for in blood. The shootout devolved into a brutal, personal war. While Nora and the other defenders kept Vale's men pinned, Cole charged Crow. The two men met with a force that was years in the making. A collision of honor and brute greed. It was not a fight of fancy gunmanship, but of fists and knees and knives in the choking dust. Crow was stronger, but Cole was fueled by a cold, righteous fury. He fought for his home, for his wife, for the friend who lay bleeding just feet away. The struggle ended when Cole, using Crow's own momentum against him, sent the big man crashing headfirst into a sharp rock wall. Crow slid to the ground and did not move again. As the last of the gunfire died down, a new sound filled the canyon. It was the sound of people, dozens of them. Ruby, her face set like stone, walked at the head of the column, flanked by the small ranchers who had fought beside them all night. They were not a mob. They were witnesses. Nora cuffed a defeated Ansel Vale, reading him his rights in a clear, formal voice. "It is over." "Vale," Ruby said, holding up the leather-bound ledger. "Your whole rotten enterprise." She began to read from its pages, her voice ringing with conviction, naming the names, the dates, and the sums of money that had kept the town in a chokehold for years. A carriage rattled up, carrying the town sheriff and a stern-looking man with the bearing of a federal official. He was Magistrate Reeves, summoned by Ruby's telegraph. He listened to Nora's report, reviewed the ledger, and then turned his cold eyes on Judge Grigg, who had been brought from the town jail. In the name of the territorial authority, he declared, "I find you, Jonathan Grigg, unfit for office. You are hereby stripped of your title and will stand trial for corruption." The assembled townspeople, who had lived under the man's thumb for so long, let out a collective roar of approval. Justice, it turned out, was not a silent, dusty thing. It had a voice. The doctor, who had arrived with the magistrate, was already tending to Eli. "It is a bad wound," he said, "but he is strong. He will live. May, freed and safe," was being comforted by the other women. Everything was settling, the violent, chaotic pieces falling back into a new and better order. Finally, Magistrate Reeves approached Cole and Abigail, who were kneeling by Eli's side. He looked at the marriage license Nora had given him, then at Eli's letter. This protectorate statute was a gross abuse of the law, he stated for all to hear. "It has no merit. However, the matter of your marriage remains." He turned to Abigail. "This letter from Mr. Vance constitutes a form of proxy, a blessing for Mr. Thatcher to act in his stead. But the law requires your own voice. In the presence of these witnesses, do you, Abigail Thatcher, affirm this union of your own free will?" Abigail stood up, her hand finding Cole's. She looked at the faces around her, her friends, her allies, the man she had almost married, and the man she had come to love. Her voice did not waver. "I do," she said. "I choose this man. I choose this marriage." The magistrate nodded, a rare smile touching his lips. "Then this marriage is valid, legal and binding, not by a corrupt judge's decree, but by the consent of those who stand within it." Later, as the sun climbed high into the sky, Cole and Abigail stood on the ridge overlooking Serpent's Cut. The bodies had been taken away, the prisoners were in custody, and the future of Coyote Wash felt like it was being written on a fresh, clean page. Below them, the land that had been fought for, bled for, and nearly lost was peaceful now, bathed in the clean morning light. The wind that whistled through the canyon no longer sounded like a threat, but like a promise. Cole's arm, bandaged but strong, was around her. Her hand rested on his, her ring solid against his skin. They had faced down the law, the land, and the ghosts of the past. Their love had not been a simple thing, found in a quiet courtship. It had been forged in a courthouse, tested by doubt, and finally tempered in the crucible of battle. It was real, and it was theirs. The seasons that followed the fire and fury at Serpent's Cut brought a different kind of change to Coyote Wash, a change as quiet and profound as the turning of the earth itself. The fear that had lived in the shadows of the courthouse was gone, replaced by a cautious but steady hope. The first town council meeting under the new magistrate was a raucous, open affair, where the water rights to the Willow River were not seized, but shared. A water cooperative was formed, with Rivera, his shoulder now healed and his posture straighter than ever. Elected as its first manager, Abigail, no longer a subject to be protected but a leader to be respected, took a seat on the board, her voice a respected measure of fairness and foresight. The railroad came, but it came on the town's terms. Ruby's scathing and meticulously documented account of the conspiracy, published in the territorial papers under the headline, Water and Justice, had made Ansel Vale's scheme infamous. The Trans-Western Railroad Company, fearing a public relations disaster, signed a contract that included strict environmental protections and a fair lease for the water, the profits of which went directly into the community's coffers. The distant clang of hammers on steel was no longer the sound of a threat, but the sound of a future they had chosen for themselves. Nora, with her unwavering integrity, was overwhelmingly elected as the county's first official sheriff in the fall election, her star a symbol not of brute force, but of a law that served all. Eli stayed through the summer, his strength slowly returning. He helped Cole and the other ranchers rebuild the damaged sections of the irrigation ditch, his work a quiet, steady apology for a past that was not his fault. There was no awkwardness between the three of them, only the settled peace of a truth, faced and overcome. One crisp autumn morning, he stood by the stagecoach, his bag at his feet. He was heading north, to Oregon, a place where the land was green and a man could start over. He shook Cole's hand. "You build a good life. Thatcher," he said, his smile finally reaching his eyes again. He turned to Abigail and gave her a brief, warm hug. "Be happy, Abby. It is all I ever wanted for you." They watched the stagecoach disappear into a cloud of dust, a final, gentle closing of a painful chapter. They still received letters from him from time to time, friendly notes about tall trees and endless rain, the correspondence of a dear friend. Nothing more. Their own wedding, their real wedding, took place not in a room of dusty laws, but on the open prairie under a vast and endless sky. It was not a grand affair, but the whole valley seemed to be there. May, who was now spending more time at the ranch than at her shop, and whose hand seemed to fit perfectly in Rivera's, had made Abigail a new dress, this one the color of a blue wildflower. Nora and Ruby stood together, sharing a flask and a private smile that hinted at their own unspoken partnership. Magistrate Reeves officiated, but the vows they spoke were their own. Cole spoke of a lonely promise that had led him to an unexpected home. Abigail spoke of a duty that had blossomed into a choice she would make every day for the rest of her life. They placed rings on each other's hands, not as a brand or a contract, but as a simple, perfect circle of their own free will. The following spring, they planted the apple orchard. They worked side by side in the rich, dark earth near the banks of Willow Creek, digging holes and settling the delicate saplings into the ground. It was hard, satisfying work, a commitment to a future they could not yet see but believed in with all their hearts. Each tree was a promise, a testament to their faith in the turning of the seasons and the resilience of the land. They were not just planting trees, they were planting roots, intertwining their own lives with the soil they had fought so hard to protect. Another year passed. The rains came, soft and healing, filling the river and the ditches without wrath or fury. The new system of canals held, a testament to the wisdom of working with the land instead of against it. The apple trees, once fragile switches, were now dotted with green leaves and the promise of tiny buds. On a warm summer evening, Cole and Abigail sat on the porch of the house that was now truly theirs. The sound of laughter, rich and easy, drifted from the open door. May had opened a small apothecary in town. her knowledge of herbs and remedies making her more of a healer than the old doctor had ever been. She and Rivera were a constant, happy presence in their lives. Cole took Abigail's hand in his. He traced the lines on her palm, his touch gentle. He was a different man from the solitary rider who had returned from that long cattle drive. The restlessness was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding calm. He was a builder now, a husband, a partner. She, in turn, was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had built. The community leader, the wife, the heart of this home. He turned his own hand over, his thumb resting on the old, pale scar from a forgotten battle. He pressed that part of his hand into her palm, a meeting of old wounds and new hope, every scar. He said softly, his voice a low rumble in the quiet evening, "Is a place for hope to take root." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes on the distant, shimmering line of the Willow River as it reflected the clear, star-filled sky. The past was not erased, but its meaning had been transformed, its sorrows becoming the rich soil from which their future would grow. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share. And remember to subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.